Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. Kyira, welcome back to the show, part two. We're so excited to have you back.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes. Okay. We were just chatting before pressing record about the direction that we're going to go today, because Kyira has been on the show already, and we're going to be building off of the conversation that we had. If you haven't listened to the first episode, which was episode 43, where Kyira came in, you shared your story, and we really started diving into the first layer of a conversation around shame, where it comes from, the link between shame and disordered eating, just all sorts of sort of foundational pieces around shame. So where I would like to start with you today, Kyira, instead of, we've done your story, laid the groundwork with shame, is to dive right into part two of this conversation around shame. And really, more importantly, my curiosity, and I know a lot of people listening or who listened to episode 43, kind of have this understanding now of how shame is stored in the body, how it is leading to disordered eating, and how that's affecting them. So the question then becomes, how do we shed it? Yeah. How do we get rid of the shame? How do we process the shame out of our body? Yeah. So what are the tools and techniques that you use with your clients, around actually releasing shame? Or do we need to? I'm assuming that, right? But would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think so. Kind of getting us all back on the same page, shame is the perceived or real threat of not belonging, not being good enough, not being worthy. So it's a fear-based response in the body. And what we know is that it comes from these deeply rooted beliefs that we are not good enough and worthy. And so we've been trying to make up for that deficiency. We've been trying to, whether that is your weight, how you eat, what you wear, your socioeconomic status, the job title that you have, where you're living, sort of the facade that we create and the performance that we develop to prevent anybody from seeing that we're not good enough and worthy. And so anytime someone gets too close, almost like the feelers coming in, like, oh no, somebody's going to see it. Someone's going to find this out. Your performance is going to be ruined. Shame kicks in. And so for many of us, if I were to take each person listening right now, and we were to have a conversation about what does shame look like for you? How is it showing up and what is it rooted to? The hard part is it's decades deep, multiple decades deep. My shame now might come out about something that's specific to my life in this moment. I have a lot of mom shame that comes out if I don't handle an interaction the exact perfect way that my brain thinks I should. Or if anybody that's ever been around a little kid, if you're a parent, a caregiver, if they're having a tantrum in public and you immediately feel shame, like everyone is judging you, everybody thinks you can't handle it. Well, I obviously didn't have mom shame as a kid. I wasn't 7 going, people think I'm going to be a terrible mom. It was about something different, but the root or the core all comes back to these same beliefs. And so the really tricky part is a lot of people try to give you quick tips, quick things to fix it, to make it go away, to not live inside of your shame. There are ways that we can stop it from controlling a moment, but the true healing is about going back and processing, where did this even come from? And honestly, what does my body need at those points in time in my life to not absorb that as the only possible reality about who I am? Could I get to a place where I doesn't have to believe I'm the best person in the room, but it's also not believing you're the worst person in the room. Could you just be a person in the room without it constantly being this sort of subjective ladder system? And so I think as people are thinking about this and they're going, okay, I'm overwhelmed, now what? Because the answer is, what do we do about it? And this sounds like this is decades of work. I think the second part, when you said, how do we process it? How do we heal from it? Is then the acceptance of knowing that shame is always going to be a part of our life, because shame is trying to help you. Shame thinks it's being helpful. When it kicks up, it thinks, I'm protecting you from being seen. So there's a point where we want that reaction, but could we guide it to something that isn't such an intense feeling? So I think for a lot of us, it's just realizing you're always going to feel it in different ways. The goal is not to get rid of it. The goal is to figure out, how do I stop allowing it to dictate every decision? How do I stop giving it where it's almost like that automatic reaction where you've done something, you're like, I don't even remember doing it, I just did it. How do we get to the point where that doesn't happen? I think that's a lot of the work that you do with people when we're talking about sugar. We're talking about a lot of those impulses in the brain. It's creating those mindful pauses and gaps so that the action or the outcome of those feelings results in something that feels more aligned with who you want to be, your values, your intentions, your goals, and not ridden by shame, fear, all these other things that you're holding in the body.
Yeah. Yeah. It would almost be like this switching that immediate response to curiosity is what comes up for me, right? I do a lot of that with my clients. It's like, instead of feeling ashamed of binging on ice cream last night, like, how about we get curious? Right. How about we also really fully understand that we're human?
Right.
And yeah, you're going to eat junk. I eat junk. This last weekend, I ate some junk. And I was like, damn, that felt horrible. Why did I eat that?
Yeah.
Right. And like, instead of shame, it's like that self-acceptance of, okay, I'm a human. Like, I'm not bad here. Right. And working through, like you said, those beliefs, right, about like, I've done something wrong, or I'm a horrible person and people are going to hate me and I'm going to be judged.
Right.
And like, just the layers there. Right. But the curiosity.
Well, and what you just said, I think, is key, because a lot of it is even just that subtle switch in our language. So when it's, your brain goes to, I failed, I'm a horrible person. If we're thinking about food, if we're thinking about maybe after a binge, subjective or true binging, that reaction of, I'm fat, I failed, I'm gross, I can't control, I'm out of control. All of those are making you the problem. If I am out of control, that's very different than saying, I feel out of control. I'm having a thought that I can't control this situation right now. And so a big part of it is when we focus on anything that labels us as a person as the problem, that's shame. If we can say, I'm feeling fat, or I think I'm fat, or I see myself as fat when I look in the mirror, whatever those thoughts are, it still doesn't feel good, but we can process through it in a different way. I'm feeling out of control. Okay, what would it look like to feel in control? What does that look like to see a food and not get consumed by that? And so I think for a lot of us, it's that switch. And so I think about so maybe here's pocket tool number 1, I feel versus I am, or I think versus I am. And if you can switch that subtle language, that invites the curiosity. Why are you feeling out of control? Yeah. And it also allows you to be more specific to that moment, instead of going, I'm fat, and then you connect it back to, and I've always been fat, and I always feel like I can't control anything. And now here's the last 762 times that I have eaten too much and I feel this way. See, the path is never going to change for me. And it just becomes a compounding stressor versus, no, this situation, even if there are similarities, I have the right to be curious about this one here, right now. What is going on? What are the cues? What are the decision points? What control do I have here? And how do I want to anchor on that?
Yeah. Wow. So powerfully said. I really love that piece around the language, right? I accidentally kind of spoke that in, but it's so true, right? This I am, and I speak a lot to that when we talk about sugar. A lot of listeners, a lot of people out there are, I am a sugar addict, right? When we put the I am, we almost like subconsciously cling on to this identity, right? And then our subconscious and our body doesn't think there's a possibility to change it. So I always, and I preach this from the rooftops, do not say you're a sugar addict. You can say things like, I feel out of control with sugar, like you've said, right? Or I have, dependency problems with sugar right now. Like language is such a powerful tool, and it's so simple. Just catch ourselves. Like switching from that I am, like, are you claiming and owning identities that you don't actually want? Because the more you do that, the more you're just going to latch on to that. Yeah, that's really powerful. This is also reminding me of, I remember, I think it was Gabor Mate that first like explained this. I know I'm a big fan of his and follow his work around addiction. And what he found and what he shares is this root of addiction being in shame. Yep. And I'm curious if you can speak to this. I can't remember if we talked about this in the first episode, so we're doing it again because it's coming up for me. But there's this difference between being ashamed of who you are and being ashamed of something you did. Those are very different. What we're talking about here is this like I am shameful. There is something wrong with me versus, oh, I did a shitty thing, right?
Right.
If you accidentally, if you binge on sugar or, like that's a different act versus claiming that as, and obviously when those two go together, when you're constantly doing things that you feel ashamed of and you're just using that as fuel for, well, I am ashamed of myself because I'm doing all these things that are not in alignment with what I want to do. So yeah, can you speak to that a little bit? Like, is there a difference there in your practice that you see and, how do we start to sort of navigate those pieces?
Yeah, so I really differentiate those two things as shame versus guilt. And so shame is very person centered. So again, the idea of I as a person am problematic. I'm broken. I am unworthy. I am not lovable. My formal master's training, and I think most people in the mental health and the therapy world are familiar with cognitive behavioral training and therapy, but it is kind of the dominant theme. So the term I think about is core beliefs, but there are a lot of different modalities that talk about just basically your central tenets of self. And so your core beliefs are basically these innermost beliefs, thoughts, truths, perceived truths that you have. And so if my perceived truth is I am unlovable, I am unworthy, everything is going to anchor to that. So all of your shame-based thoughts then are always going to connect back to you as being the problem. Guilt is values-driven. So when I think about now, my 3-year-old, well, she's 3.5, I guess at this point, and which I don't, if anybody's been around little kids, that really makes a subtle difference because she is like 3.5 going on, I don't know, 18 and also like 85. Like there are so many things about her personality. And so when I'm teaching her right now about consequences, good, bad, neutral consequences, we have to be really specific about focusing on the behavior. Why is the behavior that you did problematic? But also, how do I validate you as a person? How do I validate even the impulse, the thought that you had? But when you asked me if you could have a piece of gum, and I said, not right now, and then you tried to kind of whine, scream at me to get gum, and I said, it sounds like you're upset about that, and we're not going to have gum right now. I can understand that's disappointing. Then you got pissed because it didn't work, and you decided to kick me. That behavior is not okay. And so then what we focus on is, it is not okay to kick me. It makes complete sense. You wanted the gum and you're feeling angry, sad, disappointed that you're not getting it. That is valid. And we need to talk about some other ways that we're going to deal with that. Yeah. So that is where what we're trying to do is cultivate values-driven guilt with lying, with hitting, with hurting people, with being the asshole kid on the playground. We've all done it. We've all been the jerk and the one that's like taken on the jerkiness from somebody else. The goal is to condition a value inside that says, ooh, that didn't feel good to me. I didn't like that. I didn't like that when I hit my mom, she looked scared and sad and she didn't want to be around me. And so it's not even about the reward anymore. It's not even about, well, that didn't get me the gum, so that didn't work. I mean, when they're 3, that's the thinking as well. Shit, okay, well, that didn't work and now here's the consequence. I'm not going to do it again. But as they get older, that's the goal. So for a lot of us, we didn't get the emotional validation and the identity validation. Instead, it was you were a problem. What you were doing was wrong. It was causing an issue. It was getting in the way. Probably you had caregivers or adults that was, that be seen and not heard, or just stop causing problems. Be the one that just is easier to go along with things. Maybe you had a sibling who you felt like they were quote unquote a troublemaker. So your job was to be the easy kid or whatever that is. And so inadvertently, and it could have been either kind of constantly being labeled as the problem or being conditioned to see yourself as the golden child. But we've all had some sort of experience in some way that now we don't get to see that validation of, again, the thought, the want, the desire, and the feeling, and then the talking about whatever the behavior was. And so for us now, we don't know how to do that. So then if we use the sugar piece, you eat a bunch of sugar, instead of going, gosh, that behavior was a response to something. What was the emotion I was feeling? What's my body going through? What am I trying to do? We don't have that distinction. So now it can't be, well, gosh, that feels maladaptive. That didn't line up with my values. Instead of using my voice, instead of talking about how I felt, instead of giving myself space and kind of feeling something fully, I avoided. I detached. I numbed out. that's not a value that I want to have. I want to consider other ways to do it. So that's really how I talk about it and kind of break it up. And I think the big piece is the I am this versus, again, going back to that language, I thought, I felt, I did this. And then coming back to where do I need to validate and honor myself? And then where are the actual tweaks and changes that I want to make?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So much goodness in what you just shared. I can picture everybody listening just nodding their heads to a lot of what you've shared. I know my clients very well. I know a lot of you listening really resonating with that, right? Like these patterns that are showing up based off of, you know, the guilting, the shaming, taking that on as ourselves. And especially the emotional validation piece. I work a lot with my clients with this because none of us got it. I'm just going to blanket statement that none of us got the validation. Our parents didn't know. We didn't know how important emotional validation was or even what it was to be held space for. And I mean, your daughter is so lucky, Kyira, to have you really
thank you.
Like understanding this. And it's going to be amazing. It's almost like your own little experiment for like emotional health, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Raising this human that, you know, gets to really understand her emotions and feel safe expressing them and learn how to do that, right? So it's not kicking mom, but maybe it's going and punching a pillow, right? Or something like, or having a good scream if that's what they need, right? Like to move that energy. So I think that's really beautiful because I mean, I didn't get that. And it was interesting because as you were sharing about the, like either becoming the golden child or being the problem child, I feel like I almost kind of ended up in both in a way. Like it was a problem that I was so sensitive and so emotional. Like that part of me was not received or held or even understood, right? I was just, Danny's too sensitive. And at the same time, my brother was the real troublemaker. So I was also like the favorite child. I was also the good grades. I was the good girl. I was the good girl that didn't do anything wrong, right? And then as soon as I did something wrong, oh boy, there was some major shame there, right? Disappointment, shame. So, you know, I can see how that came in. And it's just interesting as you shared that, I noticed like those both kind of existed for me at different phases and different parts of me, I guess.
Well, then think about that, especially if if you're too sensitive, the problem is then you have to turn down your emotional reactions, and typically too sensitive. Absolutely. So for anybody that's thought that, it's not, well, you're too happy, you get too joyful. It's you're too sad, you're too angry. It's these quote unquote negative emotions, or, you know, we were talking a little bit offline before we hit record, but the difference between good and bad. And so it's often, if we use kind of the general idea, we were taught certain emotions are bad, certain emotions aren't the ones that we should be experiencing, or there's a threshold we can have them and they need to look a certain way, and then we need to get them in check. And so for you then it's, how do I tame that even more? How do I hide it? How do I detach from it? How do I get to a place where either if I have them, I don't let anybody else see them, or the ideal is, how do I make it so I don't ever have to feel them? And that's all those little things are ripe for behaviors like sugar and sugar addiction to come into play to kind of help detach our body, use something else to get dopamine hits, engage in other behaviors for detachment, avoidance, for fulfillment, whatever that looks like. And so if we go back to it, we're not also saying your parents or caregivers sucked and they're the problem, they're the reason you can't do this. We're not creating a case for somebody else being problematic. What we're trying to do is build context to understand there's always a bigger game at play that got us to where we are now. So when we're looking for quick fixes and solutions and you buy that product, or you engage in this thing where somebody guarantees you're never going to have a problem with sugar again after my 30-day program, you are always going to have a relationship with sugar that you're going to have to put in check, because it's a relationship that has served you. It's a relationship that gave you something during times that were painful, overwhelming, and it was the thing you felt like you had. And it's always going to be something that your brain is attuned to know is there if things get too overwhelming, too whatever. And so it's, instead of thinking the goal is I can never struggle with this stuff again, and sure, if we were talking about cocaine or illicit drugs, it would be a little different maybe than talking about sugar. But the reality being, it's a complex thing. We're going to have sugar for the rest of our lives. It's going to be in our bodies, and our relationship will always sort of ebb and flow. And so you say, how do I give myself grace in this evolutionary and iterative relationship with something that at times I haven't known how to engage with in a way that serves me? And how do I give myself the love to know that when that happened, that was just my body trying to deal with, again, something that could be as subtle as feeling like I'm too sensitive, but it gets bigger over time in the silence of not being able to talk about it and heal from it.
Yeah, for sure. And not feeling safe to
Right.
be there
Right.
as well. A lot of my clients, I know a lot of you listening, right? There's this, it's not safe to feel in our bodies because it was never welcome and we were never held in that.
Right.
And I feel like that is one of the major root causes of most of our numbing patterns, addiction in general. And
Right.
Gabor Mate really, really does that. It's a safety piece. So, okay, this is so fascinating. And I know one of the, other big areas that I want to dive in with you today, and I think ties really beautifully into shame because all of this is intertwined, ladies, is comparison, the judgment, the comparison game. And we live in a world now where it is worse than ever, right? We have social media, we have even you and I, right? Hosting podcasts, running businesses. There's just comparison left, right, and center. And we're really bred and taught, to be in this comparison game, and it's not serving us. I'm just going to say it. It's not serving us, and especially as women, we're constantly looking at others and using that as proof that we're not good enough, right? Or that I'm not skinny enough. Look at her, right? Or she's doing better than me. Therefore, and I mean, this obviously can bring in so much shame. So why do we do this, Kyira? Why do we compare ourselves to others, even though it just harms us?
I mean, so there's two answers that go hand in hand. So one is systems based and one is our ego based. And so from a systems perspective, if we really break down, again, everybody listening lives in different parts of the world, but me speaking from the US, I can really only talk about ladder systems of oppression here, but we know they exist elsewhere. And so the idea is when you live in a world, when you live in a community, when the culture that exists is founded on hierarchies of success and value, you are primed to absorb that in your way of thinking and operating. And some people are like, I don't think that my community is XYZ, or if you're not from the US, you're probably thinking, oh, the US has a lot more problems than we do. But if we break it down, it's more when you were in school. How was the kid treated that got all A's and dressed maybe more proper, quote unquote, proper, versus the kid who was wearing all black and their head was down and they maybe got D's on their report card? How were they viewed? How were they treated? What slack were they given versus somebody who was constantly getting 100, 105%, doing the extra credit work, helping out the teacher, always had something positive to say? What you see there is a hierarchy that's created based on grades, based on actions, based on behaviors. When we think about, again, we could use thinness as an example. When you live in a culture that promotes, well, a thinner body means they're smarter, they're more active, they're more of a go-getter, they're more engaged, they're more willing to push through, they're grittier. There's all these baseline things because of how we've seen it show up in who gets promoted. How are these things happening? So then the people that aren't, it's only recently that we've even just started to see people being seen in advertisements that aren't thin, white, cisgender, heteronormative, like couples and groups and individuals. And so when you look at that and you go, okay, well, these are all the messages that I've seen, and most of it is subtle. It's not conscious. It's not, well, white people are better than black people, though some people will say things more directly. If it's like, well, thin people versus fat people or bodies and things like that. It's the subtle, subliminal messaging. It's the little cues. It's the little things that our body has paid attention to for decades that say, well, this is how the system works. So that primes our brain from the time that we're born. We're absorbing it. And then the second layer of it is us already believing that we're not good enough and worthy. And so we have to do whatever we can to climb up above the ladder to be okay. So the comparison piece is done in two ways. There's up comparison or down comparison. So if we compare ourselves to people who we think are doing it better, that's the one I think a lot of us are at risk of, which is, well, that person has more followers than me. That person's podcast is in the top 3% and mine's not even charting. That person is in a thinner body, or they wear a different size, or they worked out 6 times this week and I only worked out once, or whatever that is. We compare it with somebody we think is doing it better. That's a tool of our shame to keep us in a system of believing, see, you're not good enough. You can't rest until you perform better. So it's this drive of either perform better, do it more, lose more weight, stop doing this, beat yourself up about it, or you better detach and leave the room so nobody sees it. That's where those addictive pieces come into play, the numbing out component. And then the second side is then we compare ourselves with people we think are doing worse. So then at least I'm not that mom. at least my kid's not doing that. So at least I'm not that shitty. Look at me. And so then what happens is when we use that as the way to feel okay, or we put people up on pedestals, we even see it with celebrities or big figures, we take away the essence of humanity and the sort of graded up and down experience. So then everybody that we basically snapshot to one image of them, one performance piece of them, and then how we measure up is based on that as well. And so it becomes content versus context-driven viewpoints. Content being the numbers, the size, the whatever it is. They can lift 100 pounds and I can only lift 10 pounds. So it's all based on that versus the context of saying, well, that person's been working on weightlifting for 8-10 years and they've been really focused on kind of building up their growth and all these pieces. You've been weightlifting for 3 weeks and this is new to you and you're nursing a shoulder injury and, you know, whatever those things may be. So it's bringing that context in. But in the moment, our ego could give 2 fucks about context. It doesn't care because it's just looking at it for the threat. And so the threat is somebody doing it better, or the threat is if you are not above enough of the other people to keep status in the room. And that's really where that comes into play. And so it feels like, if anybody has seen Inside Out, the fear part of your brain, that little character, that is what's happening, is assessing for any risk, which is you not being good enough and or needing to be enough ahead of everybody that you can take a breath.
Right. To give yourself a break. Wow. Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think a lot of my clients, a lot of listeners also would look at me and figure, oh, Dani's got it all figured out.
Exactly.
Right. And she doesn't have sugar cravings anymore. And wow, she's just perfect.
Yep.
And like, I've been on my journey 7-8 years of like deep inner healing, deep inner growth, practice, failure. And you're so right. People don't see that, right? And I even catch myself in that, seeing people with podcasts way bigger than mine that have been doing it 10 years longer. And I'm like, of course their podcast is bigger than mine. But yeah, it's amazing how our brain just totally doesn't take that into account. We just see the snapshot. And, you know, I love that you pointed out, and I want to say this again, you already said it, but I think it's a really important piece, is the societal piece, right? When we are in this hierarchy, our brain is always on the lookout to fit in so that we can survive, right? So how do we fit in is we kind of label things as good or bad or better or worse, right? And where do I fit in this hierarchy so that I can be accepted? And this comes back to the very first thing that you said when I hit record about shame, right? Is this basic need to be accepted, right? And how we contort our personality, our bodies, ourselves, in order to fit in.
Yeah.
Right. And we're always on this lookout, and it's exhausting.
Yeah.
This comparison game is like constant exhaustion. So how do we get out of that? Or can we even get out of this like comparison judgment game? You know, what do you see, and how do we even do that if that is possible?
Yeah. I mean, I think about this in the context of very similar to shame, where you have to admit that it's a problem and that it's there. And I think from a comparison standpoint, it's a willingness to admit that our systems are skewed and flawed. And I think for a lot of us, there can be a resistance to that. There can be a defensiveness in that, because if it's, well, I'm still engaging in this system, or what does this mean about me, or it's so overwhelming. And so I think just realizing that the system is designed in a way that is driven by human behavior to compete and to compare. And I would love to think that decades from now, we could have a system that looks different. That's not where we are now. So how do you accept that you are existing in a world and in a system where some people are treated better and some people are treated worse? And there are times that you have privilege based on those pieces, and there are times that you don't. And I think for a lot of us, because, you know, whether it's disordered eating, severe anxiety, trauma, so many of us are all or nothing thinkers. Things are yes or no. Everything has to be black and white. And that's a vigilant response in the brain to just have simple answers. We can't have ambiguity because that's a potential threat. That's a risk. And so this idea of, well, I'm either good or bad. I'm either thin or I'm not thin. I'm either, you know, healthy or not healthy, whatever those things are. We need to be willing to admit that that's a system that doesn't work. That our perception of something, that all of those things are subjective. All of those things are, again, contextual. And when we think about a full and complete person, it's not based on just the 4 or 5 bullet point lists. Right. And so it's kind of coming to that awareness and that acceptance that we do live in a world where we're always going to be pushed to do that. I am always going to be pushed to compare to other people. I do corporate wellness work, and the work that I want to do is about long-term change and permission giving and shifting our mindset. And when they are looking at your numbers and they want outcomes and they want, well, what does that do for employee retention? And what does that do for this? They're putting me in a position to say that my worth of what I'm saying is based on the numbers I can produce. And now there are times that's beneficial for any part of our life, but a lot of the times we're just too reductive. We need to see that this is what the outcome is. I'm sure you've seen this even with somebody considering a program or doing coaching. It's, well, what are the exact things that I'm going to see? How quick are the results going to be there? What is that going to look like? Because we're programmed for that. Yeah. And so I think the comparison piece is really resisting that, or learning that when that is happening, it's naming that it's tied to those systems. Instead of it being, okay, well, how do I get to this point? How do I get to this level? Or how do I whatever? It's starting to take a more neutral place. So we'll use the podcast comparison as an example. When I see somebody and I think, okay, that person's amazing. They're getting so many downloads. I could never be in the same room as them. Why do I even try? Ask yourself, what is that thought leading me to? Well, at the end of it, the thought is leading me to not engage as openly and as willingly with my podcast. So either I'm not going to do it, or I'm going to do it, but I'm going to kind of withdraw a bit. I'm going to be guarded because I'm going to tell myself I can't get there, thus creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that says, see, you are shit. You're never going to get there. Right. On the flip side, when you do it and you say, oh gosh, that person's podcast is terrible. I'm surprised anybody listens to it. And you do that piece. You think, mine's better than that, so that's going to succeed. You're also setting yourself up for self-fulfilling prophecies, because one, if it isn't immediately successful and exactly what you want it to be, you are going to find ways to shift to the other side. Again, that all or nothing, good or bad. I either suck or I don't. But on the flip side, what you're saying is that person's value is reduced to the number of listeners that they have. So that person is only worth being listened to if 100,000 people say that they're worth being listened to. And that's the same sort of thinking that comes into play when we're on the opposite end of it. I'm not worth being listened to because I don't have this. This person is only allowed to be in this room or to be speaking or to wear that outfit. I think about my grandma. She stopped wearing shorts when she was in I think she's maybe in her 70s, might have been early 80s at the time, because her knees looked too old. So then this idea, and it was this battle until she died at 96, and it was this notion of, okay, so what you're telling me is you can't do this because you're this age. And so then if somebody does it at that age, there's something wrong with them. Again, binaries and comparison points. So instead we say, what difference does it make? Why is this person's value any less because they've got 100 followers versus 100,000 followers? Why are your knees less deserving of wearing shorts than somebody else's based on their age? Why is that person less able to have a donut because they wear a size 12 versus someone who wears a size 0? Or this person is fat and lazy because they're doing this and they're in this size body versus this. And so it's about owning, and I think this is the tricky part, it's not only owning how the system is wronging you, but owning how you're wronging others in the system. And that's really hard to hold because your shame's going to want to use that against you. So I know I'm not giving a clear answer, but I want to peel back the layers enough to recognize that this really is, it's thinking systems, it's processing and connection systems. And when you've spent, I'm 35, I have been doing this work now for maybe 10 years. I am nowhere near a point where I don't immediately, when someone walks in the room, I have bias that I have to check. Yeah. And now what I can do is I can name it, I can own it, and I can talk about it openly to know that doesn't make me a terrible person. I am not a bad person because I'm existing in this system. I am a person, though, that wants to learn how to break out of it. And I think if we can get to that place, and to recognize that at the roots of both sides of those scales, on the all or nothing, the good, the bad, the I'm right, I'm wrong, both sides lead back to shame and you ultimately feeling like you are unworthy and unlovable unless or if blank.
Right. Wow, so much in there. I very much resonate with that and feel this conversation like around shame and around comparison. Like what I hear you saying in that is really coming down to this, like being able to love and accept ourselves. Right. I know for me, that's been a big part of the process. And what I guide my clients through is the more we fully understand who we are, which by the way, most of us have lost. We've been like socially conditioned out of even knowing who the heck we are, hence midlife crises. and really coming home to ourselves in that way.
Yes.
That we can accept our humanity. Like you're saying, it's not about being perfect. And I know most of you listening have a coping mechanism around perfection, but this like really truly understanding that I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to fuck up. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to be biased. I'm going to judge. I'm like, all of this is part of the human experience. And like you said, at the beginning of that was this acceptance piece, accepting that like, this is the world that we live in. And it's not good or bad. And societally, like this is systemic, right? When you were talking at the beginning, what really came up for me is something that I'm very personally working on in my own life, even energetically. We live in a patriarchy. Like this is the hierarchy, right? And the black and white thinking, the good or bad thinking that I know a lot of you listening to this struggle with on a daily basis. Like I have to have all the cookies or no cookies. And I'm a bad person if I do one and a good person if I do the other, right? That is very masculine. Like this is very masculine energy versus the gray in the middle, which is where I am personally still working at being more in my feminine, right? Being more in the it's okay not to know the answer kind of mode. It's okay to kind of be flowing in between the black and the white, right? I'm not good or bad. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle doing my own thing that's in alignment with me. So I'm curious because this come up a few times. Let's more specifically kind of dive into this good or bad conversation, and especially around food, and where this comes from. I know for me, a lot of that and most listeners, this comes from childhood, right? Is this, you're good. Like I was the good girl, right? My brother was bad. Right. So it's our behaviors are good or bad, and then we're good or bad. And then obviously the black and white mentality that the diet industry comes and plays in on that good or bad kind of dynamic. You can eat these foods, but if you eat these foods, you're bad, the whole thing, right? So how can we learn to actually get into our bodies and live life, and especially maybe eat food, right? Nourish our bodies without actually getting into labeling ourselves or food as good or bad?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things, obviously, again, I'm going to use my kid as an example because I'm trying to learn through how I talk about foods with her. So as someone in an eating disorder recovery, as someone who has worked with people with eating disorders for however long I've been in practice at this point, that is one of the hardest pieces. And now some of the rules come from the addiction. Some of the rules come from that hypervigilance, that fixation, that deep-rooted shame. But what we see is things like, well, if you're not good, we're not going to go get ice cream. If you don't eat all of this food, you don't get dessert. You have to eat these foods because otherwise you weren't a good eater. Or, oh, you're such a good eater, you ate your whole plate, versus you didn't eat much. They're a picky eater. They're a bad eater. So there are these subtle little messages that come into play from the people around them. A lot of that can be our own food rules too. We even see things like I had a client, I think she was 12, but might have been 13 at the time. And she was in her eating disorder recovery. I saw her after a stay in the hospital, and we were working in an intensive outpatient program together. One of the things that she struggled with is her stepmom never ate anything but lean cuisines. And so she's like, well, but that's what I'm supposed to do. Her dad and her brothers would eat this other food and would eat these other things and have desserts and do all that. But that was her one female role model. And as a person who identified as female and she wanted to fit in, again, the system and the design, well, why does she get to eat this other food, but I have to eat this? This food is going to make me fat. I can't eat dessert. She's not eating dessert. So it's these, again, the indirect, but also the direct experiences. And it's oftentimes it comes from a good place. Even, and my mother-in-law and I've talked about this, she grew up in a very different mindset. So she'd say things sometimes of like, oh, she ate really good today. She had all of this food. And I'm like, well, she ate today. Let's take that out. Let's not do those pieces. Or, oh, well, we can't have this if we don't eat these things. And then she'll catch herself. But she's had to work so hard at that. And at first there was shame of, oh my gosh, I'm a shitty caregiver. And then there was, I'm going to ruin her life. She's going to have a hard relationship with food. And then it's walking it back to say, well, no, this is what I learned. It makes sense I do it. I just want to catch myself and correct it with her. So I think for a lot of us, if we go back, again, some of it was probably these very direct experiences. I can remember people making comments about my weight or making comments about food, but a lot of it is that subtle element. It's that idea of, okay, if I ate this, that was bad, or I didn't eat this, or carrots, you suffer through carrots to get to cake. So then you don't even get the opportunity to develop a positive relationship with carrots. And then I think it's also the pressure that parents feel of, well, I've got to get my kids to eat all these foods. They have to do these things. So they push it instead of realizing, gosh, if they just didn't eat it today, they'll be okay. Just keep offering it. But you also don't have to offer these other choices. But if you make it dependent on these things, like we've never done dessert with a meal, we can have dessert. We eat dessert. I have the opposite problem, I think, where it's like I want to introduce it, but I'm so scared that I'm going to introduce it the wrong way because I have all this panic that I'm like, oh my gosh. But it's this
that
idea.
Would be me too.
Oh man, it's hard.
We know too much.
But it is. You just go like, okay. And so the way we talk about it is, and again, this is with a 3-year-old, so maybe we might feel silly in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s talking this way. But when I think about, I'll say, okay, Everly, what would happen if you only ate bread? And then she'll put her head down on the table and she'll pretend like she crashes and she's falling asleep. Okay, what would happen if you only ate apples? And she'll kind of do that. And we'll talk about that. And we talk about belly aches and discomfort and our body not getting what it needs to sustain functioning. Okay, well, what would happen if we only ate cake? And it would be the same thing. So we try to use the examples of like something that is typically a dessert or a quote unquote reward food and then something that's not. It's like, gosh, you can't just eat carrots. That's not healthy for your body either. Your body needs all these things. So how do we give it everything that it needs? And I think for a lot of us, because we never learned balance and engagement that way, we also didn't recognize what it felt like in our body when we didn't eat those foods or when we did eat those foods. And I think you do a lot of work on this because you're so focused on the somatic now and really thinking about how our body is and isn't attuned, or our brain isn't attuned to what we're feeling. And so for a lot of us, we didn't even really think about it. Our parents, our caregivers never talked about it. We didn't realize like this is what it feels like when you do this. Or when you are feeling this way, why is that connected to maybe a negative, quote unquote, negative emotion in your brain? Why do we do those things and what do we feel? So I think for a lot of us, it's, I guess maybe first I'm going to put my plug into parents and caregivers, and I'll send you a link to this we could put in the show notes because I have a video that I did and a couple of blog posts too on 10 things that we can do, micro shifts that can really help from like body image, food neutrality. And my focus is I want to raise a food neutral, body neutral human. I don't need to promote body positivity all the time because some days you're still going to feel like shit about your body. I don't want to push it that's the only thing. I just want it to not be the thing that makes you feel like your whole identity is designed around it. If you're having a bad body image day, cool. You have every right to feel that way. You can feel like your body is gross and disgusting, whatever size you are in, however your body looks. You're having a bad hair day? Awesome. I don't need to talk you out of that. We can validate that. So really thinking about that. So I'll send you some links there. But I think for parents and caregivers, it's doing your own work and then starting to just be open with your kids. And there are times I'll say something and I get it wrong. And I'll feel the shame because I'm like, well, I'm the therapist. I'm supposed to do this right. And then you pause and you go, no, I'm not. I'm a human. Right now I'm just learning. So then I'll own it and be like, oh, shoot, Ev, when I said that, this is what it subconsciously tells our brain. Let's try using different words. Then the second part then going back to if we're thinking about healing ourselves is I think just to get curious about what falls in those boxes. So when we said good and bad foods, listeners already had an idea of what would fall into those boxes. So start to get clear on that. What are good foods? What are bad foods? What are the foods you have to eat in secret? What are the rules that you have about all of these different foods? And what are the rules that you have about when you're engaging someone? Someone's like, well, I'm a sugar addict. I'm this. And they have all this shame. Why? What's the definition? Where did you get to this point? And starting to get very clear on that. And then the goal moving forward is to start to think about how do we create more neutrality around the foods that we have? Is there a way that you can have a part of a donut with your omelet with something else instead of feeling like you had your breakfast and now there's donuts out and you go grab them and you eat 2 or 3 of them and you feel like shit afterwards and you spend the rest of your day telling yourself, see, I have no control, which leads to X number of more behaviors around the sugar. What does that look like? And when our body is communicating something different, I think coming back to, and I'm sure you have tons of episodes and resources you could link them to on how do they reattune to the body and what the body's actually needing, wanting, and feeling in those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that's even just that connecting with the feelings again, right? And there's a whole conversation there around good and bad emotions too, right? Which I know you touched on and we try not to use. So, what the big thing is that I'm taking out of what you're sharing there is communication and language, right? Like this is all about really engaging in a different way of speaking, a different way of speaking about food, about our emotions, about other people, about ourselves, right? This is like really changing the dialogue, which takes so much practice, right? And again, coming back to thank you for sharing that you're not perfect, right? That sometimes you say the wrong thing to your daughter. And I do that too. I'm like trying to rewire and speak differently about myself, to others, about things, and I still catch myself.
Yep.
Right? Like I really make a conscious effort to never say bad emotions. But sometimes I accidentally say bad emotions.
Yep.
Wait, no, I mean like heavy emotions, or trying to find other language because of, that angle. So I think that is the, coming back to what you mentioned earlier, practice, right? This practice and understanding the system that we're in of black and white, good and bad, comparison, and the shame that comes from that. So this has been incredible. I could talk with you forever, but I want to be respectful of your time and everyone's time. I can't believe that time has just flown by. Is there anything else that you want to add here at the end? Any burning pieces that you feel like we didn't touch that you want to leave listeners with?
I mean, I think the thing I'm just taking, I guess maybe for myself and my own journey to maybe invite other people to too, is finding that balance of radical responsibility. And so recognizing what's ours and what isn't. And also, what does that look like? So the mantra that I use is flexible grace in a relentless pursuit. And so I've been thinking a lot as I've experienced loss and death in my life, and it really helps you recenter on, there's that swing, again, the all or nothing kind of side of, there's the swing of, I have to live for the now. And then there's the swing for I've got 80 years or I've got, X amount of time. And we have to find the balance in that. And I think for a lot of us, it's how can you learn to be okay with your days being what they are and give yourself more grace in that of like, okay, so you ate 3 donuts today or you had however many the number is. It doesn't matter. Like, cool, it happened. You are still here and you are deserving of making a choice that feels different for you moving forward. And so I think the radical responsibility piece saying, I can't take responsibility to try to change what has happened. I can take responsibility to love myself regardless of what's happened and then get curious about and make changes moving forward. And how do I find that grace and space and how do I exist in that? And I think there's a lot there. Obviously, you can tell I'm still kind of processing through it too, but it's just learning how to be in the moment now and find love for myself now, not waiting to say that I'm okay or I'm healed or I'm better, but also staying on the journey, staying on that course and recognizing, I've been in my eating disorder recovery for over 10 years, but there are still days I wake up and it takes a lot of energy for me to get myself to eat a certain food. Or, we went to the food carts yesterday. We didn't have any vegetables. We got mac and cheese with brisket and then a chicken and waffle sandwich and then this pad thai type stuff. And I looked at it and I was like, Jordan, I didn't realize this. I think we should have gotten a salad or something to go with it. And his response was, I didn't come to the food carts to get that stuff. I came to the food carts to just eat some foods I enjoy and give myself some grace to eat them and trust that my body's not, we know the body keeps the score, but the body doesn't keep the score in the sense of you failed dinner because you didn't have 4 vegetables and then you ate a dessert. Yeah. It's going, what is the sort of cumulative way that I showed up today? How do I want to show up tomorrow? So I guess maybe to wrap up that very tangential and all over the place thought, it's just, can you give yourself permission to be in this process and realize that you're not supposed to solve it. You're not supposed to ever get to a point it feels done. And you're not supposed to get to a point where you feel like you've even gotten a handle on it in a short amount of time. You and I are a testament to that. It's been years of work and we're still learning every day. And so you have a right to be here and to talk about those things and to love yourself regardless of where you're at in that spectrum or that process. All the way.
Yeah. Wow. So beautifully said. Yeah, I absolutely echo that. And I know that a lot of my listeners, because a lot of my clients really struggle with that. And that is one of the biggest shifts that you can make right off the bat. Right. Don't even change what you're eating. Eat like crap. But if you can understand that this is an ongoing growth journey, I think so much suffering could be avoided. Like how much suffering we put on ourselves because we're not there yet.
Right.
Wherever there is. So I love that piece. Give yourself permission to embrace this journey and to know that this is just part of the ride. Well, we're here on planet Earth, right? And maybe have a little fun in it too while you're at it.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Kyira. So where can everybody come and find you if they want to come and connect, come and, you know, soak in more of everything that you're putting out there in the world?
Yeah. So I would say my website's the best place to go. So adversityrising.com. You can find links to my YouTube channel, my podcast, which is going to be coming out soon, which I can't wait because Danny is a guest on there. So at some point I'm going to be getting to promote that. And I think it's going to be an ever exchanging of podcast guesting because we could talk to each other forever. So, but everything I think coming to my website is kind of the one-stop shop to find everything there and get signed up for my email list if you want to have more of those regular check-ins and support around shame. And feel free to just send me an email too if you're like, hey, this resonated with me and I'm wondering if you have any more resources, ideas, yours or others that you could share with me. I'd love to connect with you all and to keep doing this journey together.
Yeah. So beautiful. Thank you so much, Kyira, for being here again. I love hearing you talk. You explain everything so powerfully and potently. I always learn from you. And I hope everybody listening really got to, this isn't one of those episodes you're probably going to need to listen to 4 times or more. There's a lot that Kyira shared and a lot to really conceptualize and to embody and to process. So please give yourself the time to not listen to this on 2-speed. I should have said that at the beginning of the episode, not the end. Oh, well, better late than never.
Yeah.
But next time you listen to it, half speed, soak it in. And I'm so grateful, Kyira. Can't wait for your podcast to come out and celebrate that. We'll make sure to promote that as well. And I'm really, really grateful for all the work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you for Danny. It's mutual.
Yeah. And thank you, everyone, for tuning into another episode. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for tuning into another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone you love. And if you're ready to dive deeper into discovering your root causes and patterns that are keeping you hooked on sugar, be sure to check out our brand new free workshop series that will help you kick emotional eating for good. Find the link to download this free series and other amazing resources in the show notes below.